So I'm here today with Professor Duncan Simpson. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you're a historian whose research focuses on 20th century Portugal, particularly the Estado Novo, the regime, and its broader political and ideological
Mhm.
context. So that's exactly what we're going to be discussing today as well.
Mhm.
But before we do that, I would like to give a small little introduction about the head of this regime, Salazar.
Mhm.
So we're here as well in the historic city of Lisbon, which has been shaped by periods of empire, revolution, and dictatorship. And it's from here that we turn to the man who ruled Portugal for over 4 decades, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Salazar, born in 1889 in a small village in central Portugal, rose to power in the 1930s during the time of political instability and economic crisis. Originally a professor of economics at the University of Coimbra, he was invited into government to help stabilize the nation's finances, but quickly became much more than a technocrat. As the architect and dictator of the Estado Novo, the new state, Salazar established deeply authoritarian nationalist regime that would dominate Portuguese life for the early 1930s until his incapacitation in 1968. His rule was marked by strict censorship, secret police, repression of dissent, and a firm resistance to both communism and liberal democracy. Under Salazar, Portugal remained neutral during World War II, but isolated from post-war European integration. While some praised him for preserving stability and tradition, others remember his rule as a dark period of stagnation and suppression. His legacy continues to provoke intense debate within Portugal and beyond. And that's the first thing I would like to touch in Portugal and beyond. But I feel that Salazar, unlike other dictators of the 20th century, is way less known outside of Portugal
Yeah,
um, than his fellow dictators of that time. Why is that?
definitely. I mean, that's one of the maybe that was the first thing that attracted me to studying the Salazar regime. The fact that he was so little known compared to the more famous, let's say, or infamous dictators of the 20th century, be it Franco or Mussolini or Hitler. I think probably there's several reasons to this. The fact, perhaps first and foremost, that Portugal itself is a smaller country with less influence on the international stage. Um, Perhaps the fact as well that his regime um, was not in any sense expansionist, and in this sense less likely to disrupt any of the international settlements in place. His regime wasn't expansionist in the sense that it was satisfied with the colonial legacy which the country inherited, and which was seen by Salazar as this kind of a glorious vestige from the past that that his regime was supposed to glorify and to return to its past importance on the global stage. Um, Another reason I think would have to do perhaps with the personality of Salazar himself, the fact that his charisma, because I would say that he was, or that there was some forms of charisma built around his figure, but it certainly wasn't the type of immediately striking and rather, impressive for many people, at least in terms of spectators. It was He wasn't adept of these big speeches where he would manage to incite the crowds into huge waves of enthusiasm. He was far more of his rule was far more based on a certain sense of secrecy around his figure. He didn't appear in public very much. When he did, his speeches tended to be read rather dully from a sheet of paper. He didn't have any of the ease that, for example, Hitler and Mussolini are well known for. in dealing with large crowds. On the contrary, he was quite uncomfortable, I would say, with dealing with crowds and with these big public occasions. And this, in a way, I think, tended to make him as well less attractive, let's say, as a figure to study, and certainly less well known as a result of this. But I mean, the situation has changed academically in the past 20 years, or even more so. There's been more and more international academics working on the Salazar regime. Than so, I mean, his figure has become far better known. But I agree with you that there's still a big difference between the kind of notoriety that surrounds other dictators than Salazar. And I think these three reasons probably help to explain it.
But what do you think is sparking this? It's probably not renewed, but this new interest in Salazar in the research community.
Um, Interesting question.
Is it just long due that it's finally being researched properly?
Yeah, I think it was long due, definitely. Uh, there's also been waves of new methodologies, new research methodologies that historians have been able to apply to the Salazar regime, opening up, totally new venues in terms of how to interpret the actual significance of the Salazar regime, questioning, for example, the way power itself was exercised. And in this sense, these are big themes which are relevant not only to the study of Salazar and his regime of the new states, as it was called, the Estado Novo, but tie into obviously academic themes which are relevant to all European or even non-European dictatorships of the 20th century. And in this sense, having the Estado Novo integrated, or rather, I should say, the integration of the Estado Novo within the greater academic community, international academic community, was a way also of shedding a new light on these broader themes, which only a regime such as the Estado Novo could help to shed. So I suppose this, in a sense, contributed to the regime being, more and more worked on in the past 15, 20 years.
And I think you already mentioned that he wasn't known for giving these elaborate speeches to massive crowds. But when I think about other dictators of the 20th century, when I think about Nazi Germany, I think about a massive crowd um, just being riled up with energy from an energetic speaker, pretty much.
Yeah.
When I think of Stalin, I think of a crowd just
Mhm.
engulfed with fear of what
Yeah.
was going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, what was the feeling of the average Portuguese towards?
Towards Salazar.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the question first of the average Portuguese, it's quite difficult
Mm.
to define what is an ordinary citizen. I mean, in my work, I've tended to define ordinary citizens as the great mass of Portuguese citizens who were not politicized. And this depoliticization predates Salazar's regime by quite a few
How is
decades.
it possible to be depoliticized though? Because
Uh,
in these
mhm.
dictatorships, you're being indoctrinated from a young
Yeah,
age
yeah.
into the system, right?
Yeah, but that's one of the specificities, let's say, of the Salazar regime, is that one of its key ingredients or components was the idea that mobilization was useful, but only up to a certain point. It's true that Salazar allowed for the creation of institutions such as the Mocidade Portuguesa, which is the Portuguese youth movement. He allowed for the creation of another paramilitary adults institution called the Portuguese Legion. But these institutions were always, first they were always created from above. That means, by this I mean by the regime's elites, fully controlled by them, and only after they'd reached power. And they were never meant in ideological terms to generate some kind of, blind support or overtly engaged, committed kind of individual. The main values, that were inculcated in the Mocidade Portuguesa, the Portuguese youth movement, were almost and certainly after 1941 totally aligned with Catholic doctrine, and much more likely to include the inculcation of ideas of humility, of deference towards power, and in this sense, they were never created to promote, participation, active participation in the movement's ideological development, or certainly not in the politics of the regime on a daily basis. Politics were always considered to remain the preserve of a small, prepared elite. The society that Salazar envisaged was a profoundly hierarchic society, in which politics was essentially reserved to a small elite. Um, and these institutions of inculcation could be useful in the sense of eliminating, or at least minimizing, whatever residues of liberal ideals might have still existed amongst the population, than to contributing to a movement of mass support behind the regime. It might seem a bit contradictory, but
Well, is it then that the regime aligned itself with Christian values?
yeah.
Or is it the case that the regime was molded to fit with those values, or did they influence the church to make sure the church was expressing the same values that they wanted them to?
Mm-hmm. No, Salazar himself was a deeply Catholic person. He made a name for himself in the first place as a militant in the Catholic party under the First Republic, that is before the dictatorship came into existence. So he was deeply aligned with, at the time, papal doctrine and what were the more recent developments in that doctrine. And indeed, what the regime sought was, to a large extent, that Catholic doctrine in the conservative facet, in its most conservative facet, was implemented and was used as the main source for molding the new society that he envisaged. But this particular Catholic doctrine of the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century was one in which politics as well were completely minimalized in compared to what papal doctrine believed to be the central role of Catholics, be they parts of the church, members of the church, be they members of lay movements. The importance at the time was placed far more on social activism, on spiritual causes, if I can call it that way too, and a kind of stepping back from politics. So even from this point of view, stepping back from politics, in the sense that there was the idea predominant under Pius XI, and which applied particularly well to the Portuguese case, that Catholics should not engage in contestations of forms of regimes, for example. One good example was the condemnation of the Action Française movement in France in 1926, if I remember correctly, which was a Catholic movement, a monarchist Catholic movement, And the papacy saw this with very bad eyes. This idea of associating, the Catholic cause with, in this case, the defense of a monarchy. And Salazar understood this even in a wider sense of, first, he was one of the main figures, Catholic figures in Portugal, to accept the Republic and to believe that being a Catholic did not involve necessarily defending the monarchy. And he went even a little bit more, in deeper terms than this, of the idea of removing Catholics from political disputes, as long as the regime in place did not go against the broad principles of Christian doctrine.
So they were basically taught that the attitude towards politics should be indifference.
To side,
Politics should be
yeah.
indifference. Um,
At least not to, the Catholics would be perfectly entitled to interfere or to intervene, should there be a regime in place or government in place that went against, the essential principles and the cause of the Catholic Church, which wasn't the case in Portugal while Salazar was in power. And in this sense, the activity of Catholics was to focus on other subjects rather than political struggles, which Salazar actually felt that these kind of political struggles were a form of almost of contaminating people's faiths by getting too involved in matters which they shouldn't get involved with. Of course, this also suited his own autocratic views on power. It was quite useful for him, to be able to use this argument because it also gave him a greater free hands, at least in terms of his Catholic followers, in exerting, more personal power without interference from Catholic militants.
mhm. But the reason why I asked you about the average Portuguese is
Yeah.
I heard this anecdote of Salazar being able to
Mhm.
walk the streets of Lisbon,
Yeah.
uh, basically incognito. Um, that tells me something about the attitude, or yeah, the attitude that the Portuguese had towards him. Was it just that he was so recluse that they didn't even know who he was, or was it that the average person was really indifferent to what?
Mm.
Because his regime must have involved actions that affected people's
Yeah.
personal life.
Yeah. 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 I think probably the anecdote that you've heard is from quite early on in his, when after he achieved power, um, because there are photos of him wandering around the Castel Saint George, the main castle in central Lisbon, during his famous interviews with a journalist who would become his main head of propaganda in the following years. And effectively at the time, he wasn't that well known yet because he'd arrived, at his situation of national prominence, without being a recognizable figure. But after a few years, I mean, most people in Portugal would easily have recognized him. And, after these few initial years, there's no longer any pictures of him walking around Lisbon as if he would we be able to walk around incognito. There's several reasons for that as well. The fact that there was some opposition against him, the fact that he didn't even enjoy this type of interaction with the public. I mean, several reasons would contribute to this not
Yes.
happening, basically.
And I still wonder if the characteristics of the regime, if they were shaped by Salazar, or if Salazar molded himself into a version of himself that was
Mm.
perfect to fit in the regime that was created.
Ah, okay. No, I would say here that no, that's quite consensual that Salazar himself knew exactly what he wanted, but the regime was created, completely in his image, but also with a high degree of pragmaticism. He was completely or totally aware that, at least especially in the first years of his rule, that he had to, for example, manage his image as a Catholic militant. We were speaking just now about his Catholicism, or his position as a Catholic. He was, in this particular case, very aware that amongst the elites in Portugal, the currents of or anti-clerical currents, and currents marked by laicism, in part inherited from the First Republic, which had been a very anti-clerical regime, was still significant enough not, you know, not to be ignored by him, or there was the risk if he presented himself as too deeply Catholic, if he introduced laws that would be, um, giving the Catholic Church or conceding the Catholic Church uh, certain concessions far more quickly than the situation actually allowed him to do so. He didn't. He wouldn't. He wouldn't go forward. In fact, his policy of Christianization, if I can put it this way, of the nation, was actually a very gradual policy, during which he was always very carefully balancing the susceptibilities of his more laic-minded supporters, who were also, conservatives, but who were not prepared to go back to a role in which the Catholic Church would be given too preponderant a role in society. So I say the regime is molded by him. That's absolutely undoubtful, undoubted even. But he was, prepared to make concessions according to the necessities of the political scene.
Mm. And if we look at it the other way around, what was the view of the Catholic Church towards Salazar?
Hmm.
And how did that develop as well during, because he was in power for a long time.
Yeah.
So did that develop over the course of all those years?
Hmm. No, absolutely. There's various phases. Obviously, the
Mm.
regime being so long, but the church almost instantly, at least in Portugal, but probably at the Vatican too, perceived Salazar as a very useful agent for the advancement of the Catholic
Mm.
cause in Portugal. An agent that perhaps they thought they would be able to control a lot more than they actually did.
Yeah.
As I was saying, Salazar, for example, was always adamant until the very end. He always refused to go against the established separation of church and state, which remained in place. I mean, that's contrary to what happened in Spain, for example. But although the context is in Spain is very different due to the Spanish Civil War. But the state never became a confessional state in Portugal. Salazar, I think, understood that this measure taken early on during the previous regime of the First Republic had been more or less assimilated as a given in the political culture of the country, but also in to a large extent in popular culture. There were also movements of anti-clericalism that wouldn't have accepted to see this kind of fusion of state
There was
and
pressure from the church to create this.
yeah, there was a lot of pressure initially from the church to revert
Mm.
the law of separation between church and state, which Salazar never accepted, and even on other subjects such as for example, the revocation of the right to divorce. He waited for quite some years until the concordance, actually, that was signed between Portugal and the Holy See in 1940, to finally pass this law, which made divorce impossible legally for people who had married through the church.
Wait, so first it was legal, then he reverted
Yeah,
it to being.
yeah, he
Around which
reverted
time are we speaking?
1940.
1940.
But I mean, the church had been pushing for this um, since he rose to power in the late 1920s, and he only accepted to pass this kind of law in the 1940s, applying it only, obviously, to religious marriages, and he did it in the context of 1940. That was quite a particular context in which they, um, in Lisbon, a huge exhibition had been organized by the regime, a propaganda exhibition called the Exhibition of the Portuguese World. I mean, there was a whole certain sense of celebrations, of the commemorations of the foundation of Portugal in 1140, its restoration 1640, and then its a glorious, let's say, um, rediscovery in 1940 by the Portuguese regime. In this context, and in the context as well of the signing of the Concordat with the Holy See, which was presented as well as a great, diplomatic victory for the regime. This kind of a law could be inserted with relatively less visibility, let's say.
And mm, before I want to ask you something else, but
Hmm.
this exhibition you were talking about,
Yeah, yeah,
was that to show the outside world how good Portugal was doing, or was it to show the internal people
yeah.
how good things actually are?
It's interesting because originally the Salazar and his close circle's intention was actually to be able to invite foreign leaders and make Portugal some kind of reacquire some kind of its visibility on the international stage. Unfortunately for Salazar, the World War broke out in 1939, which completely altered, the dynamic of this massive exhibition built in the site of Belém, that you might know, near the river, near the big Geronimite monastery. So it became far more of a propaganda opportunity for the domestic population.
But Salazar was quite recluse when it came to international relations as well, right? Or
Mm.
because I
Eh,
believe he wasn't really taking part in as many foreign talks as he could have.
no, no, no. Salazar actually only left Portugal twice.
Wow.
Once as a militant, before he came to power, as a Catholic militant, to France and Belgium as part of his, Catholic militant activities. And just a couple of times, maybe crossing the border to Spain to meet Franco. But apart from that, he'd never set foot abroad. He'd never even visited the colonial empire that he insisted,
Why do you think
upon.
that is?
Sorry?
Why do you think that is? Why did was he so adamant on staying in his country?
It's quite difficult to explain, isn't it? In
Yeah.
part, it has to do again with his personality and with a kind of personal aversion to travel. I mean, he used the plane once to go to Porto and hated the experience so much that he was driven back to Lisbon.
Wow. But
So that made it difficult for him to travel, I suppose. But there was also in his way of in his worldview and his perspective of power itself, it seems like he found it, perfectly reasonable to be able to deal with international questions from his own office and using communication means.
from this characteristic, one thing you could draw is that he was very nationalistic. Is that the case?
Hmm. Yeah, he was extremely nationalistic. That's one of perhaps the central ideological feature of the regime from the very beginning. And this is very clear in events such as the exhibition of 1940, which is basically a massive kind of glorification of Portugal's, glorious past of expressed primarily through the discoveries and
Make Portugal great again.
yeah, make Portugal great again. Exactly, it was a kind of MAGA
Oh,
MAGA movement
that's
before the it's here. And I suppose, yes, you can see this form of nationalism as playing a part in his reluctance to travel, but it seems as well that it was simply something that he considered
mhm.
um, he didn't really have to do to achieve, his objectives.
And to come back to the church that we were discussing earlier, the reason why he was able to stay in power for that long, is that because of that relationship with the church? Or is it meant
Yeah,
that?
it is the church. And just to come back 1 second to what you were saying about his position in internationally. Obviously, he was also careful to dispatch, um, his most trusted advisors and two key diplomatic posts. So that allowed him as well. I mean, to keep a watchful eye and to know, more or less closely what was happening on. If we think of, probably the countries that mattered for him the most at the time would have been, the U.S. Or it depends which period we're talking about, but from in the post-war period, it would have been Britain, France, the US, and so that he wasn't completely unaware of this dimension, obviously. In terms of the durability of the regime, I would say that the church definitely played a very important part. First, the church furnished Salazar with the basic principles of his ideology, be it the conservative, the corporatist organization of the economy and of society.
Did they
That
legitimize him as well in the eyes of the Portuguese?
Yeah, yeah. Although the church always defended itself of contributing directly to this form of legitimation, there are numerous examples in which the legitimation is very direct. I mean, we can go, for example, to the only assassination attempt made against Salazar in 1937, a bomb that was placed in front of the house. He used to go to every Sunday for the Sunday mass, to attend mass in a private chapel there. Anarchists had placed the bomb in the sewage system, and it exploded, but not in the direction that they had expected. So actually, Salazar was left completely unharmed. But following this attempt, the Catholic Church was rapidly involved in the effort to propagate this idea of Salazar as a providentially chosen individual, which even his escape from this assassination, shows divine providence intervening. And you can find in the archives documents written by priests, like some kind of prayers to be said for Salazar, in which he's explicitly mentioned as the providential figure. There's many discourses at a higher level, in particular at the Fatima sanctuary, um, the Marian sanctuary, in which even if the episcopate and the bishops, speaking at these events do not explicitly mention Salazar, which sometimes they did anyway. There's a whole discourse, a whole narrative articulated around the rebirth of Portugal since the early 30s, which obviously anyone listening would have assimilated automatically to the arrival of Salazar and to his regime, um, simply by by association of the dates, of the periods, and
Well, I mean, we mentioned this "Make Portugal Great Again."
yeah, yeah,
You kept referring as well to this glory period that he kind of wanted to revive, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But I don't know if I'm correct about this, but I do believe that during his reign, Portugal was one of the poorest countries in Europe, and a large portion of the population was illiterate.
mm-hmm,
So that how did those two things go
yeah,
together?
yeah. Well, first, these aspects of poverty and illiteracy were obviously not publicized. Um, so we have to differentiate, between the relatively easy to do propaganda efforts, um, which in a sense was aimed, at reshaping the mentality of the population exposed to it. Um, Obviously, it's not the reshaping of mentalities, that's going to solve the problems of poverty and illiteracy. And I think that in the reshaping of minds, for example, along, imperialistic feelings, definitely had a big impact on Portuguese society. Um, Most people that I know who underwent schooling under the Salazar regime, where even the school programs were obviously influenced not only by Catholic doctrine, but also, or it could be a combination of both, Catholic doctrine, the work of the Catholic Church in expanding, and of Portugal in expanding the Christian faith through the maritime expansion that Portugal carried out, the supposed specific mission that Portugal had as a kind of providential task, to expand the Christian faith as it expanded its own territorial lands in Africa. All these were aspects of propaganda that had a deep impact on the population. I think that was clear in particular when the colonial war started in 1961, where the large majority of the population accepted that this empire had to be defended, that
And we're
it's
talking about Angola,
yeah, we are
in
talking about Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, Bissau, and also the islands of Cape Verde and Sao Tome in
yeah,
principe.
okay.
Yeah.
So the people saw it more as a Christian necessity that Portugal has activity there to expand the Christian faith than it is more about resources or this type of
Yeah, I
things.
would say that for the common people, let's say, the idea that had been transmitted was basically that Portugal um, earned its that statute as a great nation to the fact that it owned these large territories overseas, um, and it's the idea of this imperial mystique, which I think really did impact the population. But you were talking about poverty and illiteracy. In this
Yeah.
sense, you see there's not necessarily big contradiction. First, in the sense that all the negative aspects were actually controlled by censorship and
Mhm.
very little known domestically, and even, well, not even to some extent internationally, obviously.
It seems like such a contradiction, but then, of course, yeah, there's propaganda.
Hmm.
But if people can't read, they can't read the propaganda either.
Yeah. Uh,
So,
uh,
um, I feel that there's just to the outside world, yes, this,
mm,
you can propagandize your way out of this, but
yeah.
there must have been a strong feeling within the Portuguese population of like, all right, they're saying everything is great, but nobody around me can read.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Also, we can't, exaggerate too much. It's obvious that the regime did far too little in its efforts
mm,
to promote literacy. But the rates of illiteracy did actually start to come down,
okay.
and far more substantially from the 1950s, and in particular the late 1950s, where basic education was being provided to the large majority of the population. They would have been able to read, write, and
Yep.
count more or less in rudimentary fashion, but that was something that was widespread.
But that
Uh,
initial illiteracy
yeah.
was was that by design or was it an effect of policies that were just had an extremely negative effect?
No, I don't think it was. That's my personal, interpretation of it. For a long time, there was this interpretation that the regime was purposefully obscurantist and wanted to, keep the majority of the population in the state of ignorance, and um, I don't think that was the case. Basically, I think too little efforts or too few means were placed at the disposition of the possibility of changing this situation. Definitely, it also linked into what was again, from Christian doctrine, this idea of honored poverty, pobreza honrada was the expression in Portugal, in Portuguese. That also, in a sense, meant that for someone like Salazar, the primacy of a high education for everyone was not something
Yep.
valued in itself. Um, but this had to change after the Second World War, and actually did start to change, and with diminishing literacy rates, which meant that you would have most people able by the mid 1950s, perfectly able to read whatever propaganda work was distributed, and propaganda was also articulated around other means, these large exhibitions, for example, the cinema or
Yeah,
documentaries
no,
even.
that makes sense.
Um,
You don't need to be literate to be propagandized for sure.
no, no, especially in a country like Portugal, where a lot of the propaganda could come directly from the local clergy, through the ramifications from the top, of the instructions, given by the episcopates. And it was quite a way of getting, of what Foucault might have called the capillary operation of power, of actually reaching, at the grassroots levels of personal relations, in a very effective way, I think.
But what still fascinates me the most, I think, about this whole topic is that, yes, during the regime, there were political prisoners. There were, I think,
Yeah.
even some assassinations.
Yeah.
Um, but it never got towards the violence that we might have seen in Franco Spain.
Mhm.
Um,
No.
why is it that it was able to be contained here?
Mhm. To consider, you mean the levels of violence
Yeah, the
you
level
said?
of violence against the regime, of
Yeah.
course, it boiled over at some point, but it,
Mhm.
I mean, you know way more about this than me, but I think it didn't boil over
Mhm.
to the extent that it might have in Spain.
Yeah, you're talking about the violence or opposition to the regime.
Opposition, violence, yes, this
Yeah.
type of stuff.
Because first, the case of Spain is exceptional in the sense that the civil war, gives Franco a totally different starting point than Salazar's. First, most of the anti-clerical figures or even ordinary people have been physically eliminated, during the Civil War. We're talking here about hundreds of thousands of people killed in the Civil War, a degree of terror reigning in the country, which Franco was eager to preserve and to manage in order to have its lasting effects felt on the population. The situation in Portugal was totally different. I mean, none of this degree of violence occasioned by the civil war had ever been reached. But as you were saying, the political police, it's known, for its main acronym, which was the PID after 1945. There were assassinations. Perhaps the most famous case of an assassination is the assassination of General Humberto Delgado, who had been one of the candidates, the main candidate of the opposition during the presidential elections of 1958, um, and had actually, through his mix of a kind of fearless, outspeaking manner, which was very original at the time in Portugal. He actually declared in one of his first press conferences that if he won, of course, the first act he would do would be to dismiss Salazar. And that created, this whole wave of popular first surprise and in part support for him. And he actually lost the elections only because of electoral fraud that was carried out by the regime itself. And he was assassinated in 1965 by the PIDE in Spain, through a rather elaborate plan that they managed to set in motion to attract him to the Portuguese border. and then murder him. There'd been cases as well of other militants who were either shot as they resisted arrest, or other militants tortured, extremely badly, and in quite ferocious ways by the political police. But I think that the main point here as well is to see that these groups of oppositionists were always a small minority within this great mass of largely depoliticized population, as I was saying.
But I think that's always the
Yeah,
case, right? In every dictatorship, there's always a very small fraction of opposition.
yeah,
Um,
uh-huh,
because I feel for most things, like if things go on long enough, you can get used to anything.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
mhm,
so I think that the opposition is always very small, but it's about how much noise they can make.
yeah,
And yeah, of course, I don't know enough about the history, but it seemed like in other countries they might have made
mhm,
more noise. But
mhm.
of course, I don't know about that. But this general, I believe it was Humberto
Yeah,
Delgado,
Umberto Delgado, sì.
was he assassinated because he was still a threat, or was it just because like, oh, you tried to
No, no, he was still actively engaged in the opposition,
and did they
and he
blame
was
the
considered.
assassination on, was it just out in the open, like the
Mm.
police assassinated him, or did they blame it on some rebels that
No,
done it?
yeah, exactly. That was the first strategy, was to try to blame it as a,
Mhm.
as a kind of retribution, probably by a separate oppositionist group or something of the kind. But gradually, it became relatively clear that the PID had been involved,
Mhm.
to a point to which it was quite difficult to deny it. Although at no point under the regime was it recognized that the PID had assassinated him. But I agree with you when you say that in all dictatorships, the vast majority of the population tend to not not take sides with the opposition, whether it's out of fear, whether it's for opportunistic reasons. I mean, there's a whole panoply of reasons here. What's important is that in most of these other dictatorships, if we think of fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, East Germany under the Stasi, um, Soviet Russia under the NKVD and Stalinism. The difference is that in all these regimes, the attitudes and the position of these kind of bystanding masses, we say, or masses of bystanders, if I can put it that way, they were far more than bystanders. Actually, their position was far more nuanced. At least they had been studied in the historiography. They've been considered as historical agents. Their impacts has been, analyzed. In Portugal, until very recently, the only type of history that existed was the history. Obviously, there's a whole history of the regime itself, but in terms of the rest of society, the focus was almost, or not almost, exclusively on oppositionists to the regime, whether they came from the Communist Party, from the old Republicans, from progressive Catholics towards the end of the regime. Some Catholics influenced by the Second Vatican Council started to express, their opposition to dictatorial rule and the denial of access to independence in the colonies, etc. These were the kind of sectors that are studied and, in my opinion, overstudied, in the sense that the only picture that emerged of the regime in Portuguese society for decades was that of precisely the regime on one side, as as the oppressors, repressors, and the other side, these kind of victims, basically, being either killed, arrested, tortured, and the rest of the population which is the large majority of the population, were basically relegated to this kind of statute of paralyzed of victims paralyzed by fear. You know, allegedly the fear of the PID would have meant that the rest of the population was simply paralyzed into submissive fear.
Yeah, because that's what I was gonna ask you. If
Mm.
um, you mentioned the Stasi, I feel
Yeah,
the Stasi had a document on everyone in East Germany,
yeah. It
almost
was very,
probably.
yeah,
Was it like that as well, or was it very targeted to specific individuals that were being either taken as political prisoners or being watched,
yeah,
or was it just this widespread surveillance like you might have seen in East
yeah.
Germany?
It was no, it never reached the level of surveillance that was achieved in East Germany under the Stasi. I mean, the PID itself, at the very end of the regime in '74, if I remember correctly, the exact number of employees of the PID was about 2,000, around 2,400,
So
which is a ridiculously low level. And this applied to metropolitan Portugal, but also to the vast territories of Angola, Mozambique, and the smaller territory of Guinea-Bissau during the colonial wars. So we can imagine with, a lot of
quite a few people.
y- yeah, and a lot of work to do for the political police
Yeah.
in these areas. So no, there was never this kind of blanket coverage. That's one of the points I disagree with the established historiography. Let's say it's possible that the political police may have managed to convey this idea, of a panoptic political police with eyes everywhere and informants everywhere. But even that, I find that through the interviews I carried out with people who lived in the final, 15 years of the regime, through the archival material that I've used as well, such as letters of denunciation written to the PID, petitions addressed to agents of the PID by ordinary citizens, um, letters of what we could call spontaneous applications or prospective applications that people sent in by the thousands, wanting to join the PID as a professional career within a
Mhm.
context where poverty was endemic, and this was seen perhaps by many people as one of the few open paths for people with a low degree of education to be able to get into. Because speaking about about this, obviously there were many roles within the PID which did not consist in either beating or torturing people. The PID was responsible as well for border control, for example. This would have meant simply checking passports at airports, this kind of tasks. And a lot of people write in saying that this is the type of role that they'd like within the PID.
So with
I
around
think
2,000 people, they were able to do all this.
the worst, yeah, but I mean, they were not able to do it very effectively. That is, particularly in terms of border control. I mean, between 57 and 1974, approximately 1.5 million Portuguese people emigrated, and
And
a
was that
large
that was not
proportion.
allowed? That was not
No,
allowed?
no, that was you could do it if you had the right
Mm.
documentation, but the majority of people did it illegally in a
Yeah.
clandestine fashion. Over 700,000. These are people which the PID was supposed to be there to block, the exits from the.
I mean,
But the,
yeah.
yeah, but I think that what I was saying is that what is lacking, or what has been lacking in Portugal, in the case of the study of the Salazar regime, is precisely going into taking these masses of ordinary citizens and trying to understand exactly what their strategies were for everyday survival in the material term. I mean, did they have practices were part of their practices, avoidance strategies in relation to the PID? Did they even feel afraid of the PID's presence? And a lot of my research, whether in the archives, opinion surveying, oral history interviews, seem to suggest the contrary, that a lot or a very significant parts of the population simply were not that concerned by the political police.
Yeah, because that's what I was
Because,
gonna ask you as
Mhm.
well. If what because you analyzed for your research, you analyzed letters that were sent to the people,
Yeah, yeah.
um, and you conducted interviews with people as
As
well?
well, yeah.
What
This I haven't published yet. It's going to
okay.
come out in my next
Okay, what
book.
kind of interviews with what kind of people were these?
These were people who were selected from four different towns: Lisbon, Faro in the Algarve, Viseu in more or less in the center of the country, and Braga in the north. I chose the locations for various reasons, including their proximity to a peat post and
Okay. Also, the north of Portugal is
yeah.
even more neglected than the other parts of the country, right?
In terms of the coverage by the feed, or in terms of
More in economic prosperity and
yeah.
literacy and those types of factors. I think.
It depends. If you go to the really isolated areas, of course, in mountainous
Yeah.
areas, it was yeah, the situation was worse. But most of the north was actually divided into smaller properties, small property farming, in which the population was actually better off
Oh,
than in
okay.
the southern half, which were these very large latifundia, where the population was essentially used as daily laborers, but literally on a daily basis, selecting, okay, you work
Yeah.
today, you work today, and a lot of people would end up without work, either on specific days or either in whole periods of the year when there was simply no tasks to be carried out.
But to get back to so you chose all these locations because they were close to a peat office,
Yeah,
and what
quite
kind of
close or far,
what?
and also in more Catholic areas and less Catholic areas in the south, to get various, some variables to try and analyze the
Yeah.
situation. And what several of the aspects of my findings that surprised me. The first was that the low degree of at least of perceived fear that the respondents declared feeling or not feeling in this case, um, and concomitantly to this, the sense that the majority of them felt that the peat was also there was almost something that did not concern them.
Hmm.
They rapidly became aware that the peat was precisely an institution used or directed against that minority of disorderly people. It's
I'm a normal
communists.
good person,
Yeah,
so it will
exactly.
never affect me.
Exactly. These disorderly communists or anarchists right at the beginning of the regime as well, or Republicans, and anyway, all these kind of more than that, even there was a kind of I felt that there was a form of from the interviewees in particular, a form of despising of people who thought they were clever enough to engage in politics,
Really?
which seems to replicate completely the propaganda of the
Mm.
regime about politics as something reserved to the elite. In the use of expressions, in the way they describe these people, it's as if they've the principles of Salazarism have been very deeply internalized by these segments of the population.
Are we
And
talking about intellectual elite or political elite or both?
well, people I'm talking here about only people who engaged in opposition to the
Yeah, okay.
regime, opposition to the regime. Obviously, some of which were there was some intellectual opposition to the regime. The interviewees in this case were not referring to this kind of
Mm.
people. They were referring more to lower class people
Okay, yeah.
who, because the society was so rigidly hierarchic that there was always this respect, for highly educated people, whatever the side of the ideological spectrum they were on. But I was very surprised when I heard this. I had the some example. I remember an interview of a man in Faro in the Algarve, who told me he was still quite young when this happened. It was in a rebellion that took place in a garrison in Beja in 1961, in the south, also Portugal. which was an attempted coup against the regime that didn't turn out well for those involved. Um, but he remembers how at the time his family and then the whole neighbors in the small village outside Faro were completely scared and outraged, not by the fact that this rebellion had not succeeded, but by the fact that how would anyone even think of, of disrupting
Their town.
no, of disrupting
Okay.
the order, and of some of the expressions he was using was his mother saying, "But what kind of world have we got to?" And even in military barracks
Yeah.
now, they try to disrupt the peaceful order that we have.
Wow.
And I'm talking here about people who were not even in any way Salazarist supporters, but they had just internalized completely the kind of society that the Estado Novo was able to create. I would not say from scratch, obviously, but to perfect what was already there to a large extent. The lack of politicization, the reliance on clientelism as a form for poorer people to improve their condition. I can give you maybe just one other. You have to tell me when we get to the ends.
No. Yes. I have a couple more questions and then we'll round it off.
No, I'll give you just one example because it's also very, I think, enlightening in the perspective that people had of the Pid. It was the case of an official of the Pid, quite highly ranked, who rented a house in just on the outskirts of Lisbon, a place called Ada Beja. He rented a house there for the holidays, the summer vacations. So I started reading this case that I'd found in the Portuguese National Archives, in the PED archives. And I would have thought that, having a PED agent on holiday in your little village would have been someone that everyone would have tried to get away from. Seeing him as a
Yeah.
potential
Okay.
seeing from what I'd read at the time, from the Portuguese historiography on
Mhm.
the theme, this idea that everyone lived in total fear of the bead, etc. I got deeper into the case, and as it turned out, what it was the absolute opposite that
Mhm.
happened. The people in the village actually gathered together, went to the house of this Pete official, knocked on the door, and started to ask him if he could not help them to obtain the public lighting system in the village. Because they'd been insisting, with the authorities to get this public lighting
Yep.
in the streets without any success. Um, so it showed me how different, the point of view of these were really, this is what I call ordinary citizens. I mean, the depoliticized, mostly rural and mostly lowly educated, but it continued to be the vast majority of the population right until the end of the regime. They saw the speed agent not as a threat, but as a potential,
An
um,
opportunity.
sorry?
An opportunity. An
Yeah,
official that's
exactly.
close that can help
Totally
you.
an opportunity, imagining obviously that he came from an institution, that would have significant clout within the regime, and he might be able to pass on our petition to his superiors, and in this way, we might. And it actually worked. Their plan worked to perfection. He passed their petition to his superior, and eventually the case ended up on Salazar's desk, and he wrote a letter ordering the relevant minister to have the public lighting installed by the end of the year. So here we see how in my opinion, how the clientelistic system ends up even defining the relation between the population and the political police itself, an institution that supposedly is on repression, isn't it? So by reverting your perspective, you have these sources of spontaneous interaction from below
Mm-hmm.
that actually call into question and challenge a lot of the interpretations that are considered to be, established by now. These are only isolated cases that
Yeah.
I'm giving you. Obviously, there's hundreds, thousands of these cases. You need also a certain quantitative basis to be able to argue, as to how relevant these processes were.
But from what you got right now, you don't get the feeling that when people were in a bar, they were looking around when they were making a joke or something.
No, 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 no.
That's really interesting because, but then there has to be a difference between that internalization in other ideological regimes, maybe, and
Mhm.
in the Portuguese one. That's
Because I mean, in the case of the Stasi, the situation was different, wasn't it? First, it's a high mobilization regime.
mm,
Secondly, the scale and importance of the Stasi was quite widely known
yeah.
at the time. I mean, I encountered people in. I also did an opinion survey for 400 people. It's by no means representative nationally, but even within this sample, there were a few people who reported at the time not having known about the existence of the PID until after the revolution of 25th of April.
So, do you
Uh,
think it's because they were just unaware of the there's also a dark side to this organization that they walked up to his door to ask for the streetlights because they didn't think there was any possibility something negative could happen from that? Or
I
I
think the
don't
yeah normally the cases of people not knowing about the existence of the PID at all are from more isolated areas
yeah.
where this kind of where policing was carried out more by the National Republican Guard, the GNR, and where this kind of information simply didn't really, seep into this kind of isolated communities. But that in itself, for me, is can also be taken as as a sign of the limitations of
Mm.
the bead. If Portuguese people themselves don't even know it exists until the 25th of April. Um, and the other side that you were talking about, sorry,
I mean, well, for the sake of time, there's also another research that you
yeah,
did,
yeah.
um, where you analyzed all these letters that were sent to the P, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just to conclude, maybe what is the main sentiments you took away from those letters? Because first of all, maybe what kind of letters were they? Could you elaborate on that a bit
Yeah.
more?
Um, there were the letters that I analyzed were basically they fall into three categories. There's denunciation letters sent, or I'm talking here about only spontaneous letters. People letters written by people who were unsolicited, who did it on their own
Yeah.
initiative, which already is something quite difficult for established historians of the theme in Portugal to accept because
There's this
the
willingness to approach
exactly because
the
the
government.
whole interpretation had always been based on a repression acting downwards upon a passive population, and simply by recognizing or by highlighting the fact that there were some spontaneous interactions from below, and they were much more interactions than just repression and action, let's say. um, that in itself was not very well seen, um, because it could eventually be seen or be interpreted by some historians who actually did so as wanting to try to diminish
Yeah.
the seriousness of the PID's presence in society, if not even maybe trying to whitewash the regime. I had this kind of accusation as well. And without even talking about what happens in the social media, where you become a fascist and
Yeah,
you
no.
should have experienced, you should have been tortured by the beat to know
Mm.
what it felt like. I mean, none of my work is about this at all. I think it's very important to continue to work on the opposition as well, and to keep this memory alive of the torture these people had to undergo.
Clearly, yeah.
But if you focus only on this, you're losing a
Yeah, the big picture.
huge part of the big picture, basically, because all of the compromising, all of the support as well, in part, that some of these letters represent, were also fundamental in ensuring the durability of the regime. So they're important in themselves. The importance is not just, as nice little anecdotes. They also show just how the power itself was ably used by the regime, I would say, because each of these letters of denunciation, for
Yeah.
example, of which there are thousands. I was only able to analyze part of them because it takes a long time to get the documents to be made available to researchers in the Portuguese National Archives. All of these letters were treated very seriously by the political police, even if they offered only, the flimsiest evidence of veracity, because a lot of people also wrote to create problems to their neighbors, this kind of thing, using the bead as a source of.
But are we talking about mundane stuff, or we were like
No, there's
informing on political
yeah.
value you might have heard around the corner?
I'm going a bit too fast there. Well, this no, you're absolutely right. There were different typologies within the letters of denunciation. Um, uh, One of these was, and it's quite widespread in all dictatorships. Some of them were mundane.
Yeah.
I can give you a case of someone who writes to the P because he's been refused access to a nightclub. So he writes.
All right.
He writes about the bouncer or the doorman there at the club. But what's interesting to see there is more the fact that the Pete actually goes, and in his letter he accuses him of being, possibly a communist militant.
Yeah. Okay.
But what's more interesting than this is that the Pete actually sends two of its agents to investigate immediately the day after. They actually find who this doorman was, and in this particular case, I remember that they discovered that he was the son of a very rich individual in the town, completely pro-regime,
Yeah.
and that this young person himself was, this doorman himself was totally pro-regime, engaged in various associations in favor of the regime. So it was obviously the beat concluded that it must have been someone who'd been this doorman made many enemies on that weekend because he had to refuse a lot of people, and it obviously came from there. But there's a lot of trivial cases of this type, but there's also cases of genuine duty denunciations where people feel, or the people who write, the authors of these letters, felt that it was, basically they support the regime, and they take it as a duty on themselves to partake basically in the mission of the PID in seeking out disorderly communists and other oppositionists to the regime. And in a lot of the letters of these duty denunciations in particular, certain key aspects of the Salazar ideology can be seen. For example, there's this commitment to the Catholic cause.
Mm.
It comes out very often in a genuine way. Very often it's difficult to interpret these letters because there's not always, proof of or evidence of what happened after the letter was received.
Okay. Yeah.
But also the defense of the empire once the colony started to be attacked internationally and diplomatically in the 50s, leading up to the colonial war in 1961. All these aspects come up very, very regularly in these denunciation letters, indicating, in my opinion, here a sense of association with some of the central tenets of Salazarist ideology. Um, there were also, well, I mean, these would be the two main cases of denunciation letters, let's say. Um, and the impression that they end up giving, if you combine them to the opinion survey that I carried out and to the interviews, is that you have a relation between society and, in particular, what I call ordinary citizens here, as being far more multifaceted, far more nuanced, far more complicated than this idea, of a people in the sense povo, a population paralyzed, passively paralyzed by fear and remaining passive. I think there's nothing extraordinary in this argument, you know? It's the same as you were saying before. It's been studied in other contexts. It's
Mm.
been studied in the case of Nazi Germany. It's been studied a lot in the case of East Germany. In Portugal, it still, you know, creates problems when you put out this kind of argument.
I mean, I get it though, because especially after a regime ends and terrible things
Mhm.
happen, people want things to be black and white,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
the complexity of daily life doesn't fit into those black and white categories. And I think that's what you're finding out right now with
Yeah.
all these letters.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the I think the you know there's a question of how the historiography of a theme changes, and how much society is receptive or not to certain open or not to
Yeah.
certain arguments. And in terms of the historiography, it's still difficult to write in these terms in Portugal, to a large extent because the I think that it's ideological questions to a large extent that a lot of the main figures, historians dominating or acting as kind of gatekeepers of certain areas of study, were themselves oppositionists to the regime, and their perspectives are heavily imbued
Yeah.
by their own, you know, by their personal experience. Although we all know that as historians, this is probably one of the worst errors you can make.
Mhm.
Um, and so, and beyond that, I mean, there was also an interest in society as a whole in Portugal when the regime finally ended in '74, um, to present themselves as victims too of the political police. Um, that's actually very frequent. We could take probably the most well-known example would be the case of Nazi Germany. I mean, the first phase of memory and even of historiography placed all the blame on Hitler and his main collaborators. Well, no, she is like portraying them as some kind of monsters that had managed, you know, somehow to take power and manipulate, and then exert their influence on the population through fear, etc. We know that through studies that have been made, the situation was far more complicated than this. It was never just a people of victims, the Germans. A lot of them knew exactly what was happening during the Holocaust, for example, or if not exactly what was happening, they knew something was happening that could not be considered in any way to be, a normal event. Very few of them took action against it. And again, here we need to go into not only the question of fear, but the whole other issues of opportunism, of support for the regime as well, of anti-Semitism that was very widespread in the regime. All these aspects in the regime, in society, I mean, all these aspects have been integrated into the historiography and have actually fashioned national identity, even I would say, in Germany, in which the remembrance of the Holocaust in this case um, is taken, or the guilt for it is assumed collectively now,
Mhm.
not placed, on simply on Hitler and his acolytes. In Portugal, the phase of seeing the ordinary Portuguese as as victims, has tended to continue almost indefinitely until the past 4 or 5 years, when
Mm.
more works devoted to ordinary citizens have started to come out. But a lot of people do not accept this because they consider that it's whitewashing
Yep.
the regime. It's
Well, but I think you just gave a great summary on why, especially in the coming decades, your research is going to be more and more important and more accepted as well.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, to
I hope
conclude on that, yeah, thank you so much. That was extremely fascinating, and You're still in the process of these interviews, right?
Yeah, no, no, I finished the interviews. I'm now using them for a new book on the political police that'll come out in English in the following months, and then I'll be continuing my work on letters by ordinary citizens to Salazar to try to understand how it's based in part on the history of sensibilities. See how a regime can create certain sensibilities in a society. I don't know, such as dependence, admiration, and see how this functions again as a form of social control, less more subtle than than the common forms of control that we know of, such as repression by the political police, for
Mhm.
example. Yeah.
I wish you the best of luck with all
Thank
these
you. Thank you.
endeavors, and thank you for taking the time today.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you
Thanks.
very much.